Yes, ma'am. Hello, and welcome to the 12th Annual Reed Scholars Health Equity Symposium. I am the current president, Mary Fleming, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with our organization, we are physicians and dentists who graduated from one of three fellowship programs dedicated to minority health policy at Harvard Medical School. We are named for our founder and director, Dean Joan Reed. I would like to direct you to our website, reedscholars.com or reedscholars.org, for more information about the history of our organization and some of our current activities and events. You may also access the program for today's event in the chat box, which is also housed on our website. The aim of the Health Equity Symposium is to bring together a wide array of perspectives on equity and social justice to enlighten and empower our work. Due to the theme of today's symposium, I would like to take a brief moment of silence in order to honor those who have lost their lives to police violence over the past many years. While no amount of time can, of course, bring back those lives lost, we hope that we can continue to honor them and make powerful changes to prevent any more future losses in the future. Today, I am quite excited about our theme, policing reform and public health. Our chair, Dr. Denise Williams, and the rest of the committee have put together an excellent panel to discuss this most important topic. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. The audience will be able to communicate with us through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. However, the chat function has been disabled for this symposium. Please stay tuned to the end, and we will be asking several poll questions about the symposium for your feedback. So if you could do that at the end, we would be very grateful. With that, I would like to turn it over to the chair of this year's Health Equity Symposium, Dr. Denise Williams.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you to this year's symposium committee members, and thank you to everyone who's joining us this afternoon. Last year was notable for two crises. The emergence of the COVID-19 global pandemic, which was quickly found to disproportionately impact communities of color, and nationwide mass protests and renewed calls for police reform following several killings of people of color by police. While the need for police reform has been primarily viewed through a civil rights or social justice perspective, several years ago, the American Public Health Association declared police violence a public health emergency. In 2020, APH and several health and medical organizations renewed their declarations. This year's symposium committee decided to have a program focusing on policing reform viewed through a health equity lens. We've assembled an excellent panel of speakers representing different perspectives, and we look forward to an enlightening session. We recognize that any one of our speakers could be the sole focus of a symposium, so our goal today is to begin this important discussion. Our panelists are as follows. Dr. Brian Swan is an assistant professor at Harvard School of Dental Medicine and the Harvard Medical School. He's a 2008 graduate of the Joseph L. Henry Fellowship and is a member of this year's symposium committee. Dr. Hannah Cooper is a professor in the Department of Behavioral, Social, and Health Education Sciences at the Rollins School of Public Health at Emory University. Her research expertise includes the study of social determinants of health, and she is a co-author of the book entitled From Enforcers to Guardians, a public health primer on ending police violence, which was published in 2020. Dr. Shayeri Turner is Chief Transformation Officer for Crisis Tech Line, a not-for-profit organization delivering crisis interventions using a text platform. She has served as faculty consultant for the National Center for Trauma-Informed Care, where she provided training on the neurobiology of trauma to state and local entities and education to international audiences. She is a 2002 graduate of the Commonwealth Fund, Harvard University Fellowship in Minority Health Policy. Barry Friedman is the faculty and founding director of the Policing Project at New York University School of Law, where he is professor of law and affiliated professor of politics. He is the reporter for the American Law Institute's New Principles of the Law, Policing, and author of Unwarranted Policing Without Permission. Philippe Cunningham is the Minneapolis City Council member for the 4th Ward in North Minneapolis. Council member Cunningham is the chair of the Minneapolis City Council's Public Health and Safety Committee and is the lead council member for the city's Transforming Community Safety Work. Major Celeste Murphy is Deputy Chief of Community Services at Atlanta Police Department. She leads the Field Operations Division, which is the largest division of over 900 employees. Unfortunately, Deputy Chief Murphy had to withdraw from the panel today due to the release of the Roth decision yesterday. Her division has been ordered to be on standby for possible civil protests. AMA's video statement will play next. The speakers will then follow the order listed in the program announcement. A link to the program along with full bios can be found in the chat section as well as on the Reed Scholars website. We will now view the AMA video.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Delegates, I'm speaking to you on behalf of the board today because our country is amidst great social upheaval. Like all of you, I was stunned by the horrific death of George Floyd at the hands of police. George Floyd's death was a great injustice. We know that people of color are hurting. We know that people of good consciousness everywhere are hurting. While George Floyd's death catapulted police brutality to national consciousness, there are far too many similar incidents that have occurred, some recorded and some not, where people of color and other marginalized and minoritized communities have faced similar oppression and death. Earlier this week, my fellow board member, Willie Underwood, captured this sentiment that I know you all share. We stand in opposition to racism and racist thoughts and ideas. We stand in opposition to covert and overt racism in all its forms. As physicians, we must stand in opposition to racism because it truly is a public health emergency. The House in 2018 passed policy that recognized that physical or verbal violence between law enforcement officers and the public, particularly among Black and brown communities, where these incidents are more prevalent and pervasive, is a critical determinant of health. This policy also supported research into public health consequences of these violent interactions. As the details came out about George Floyd's death, your AMA president, Patrice Harris, and I, as your board chair, co-authored a viewpoint from the AMA that declared police violence must stop. Our column went on to say that while we recognize that many who serve in law enforcement are committed to justice, the violence inflicted by police in the news headlines today must be understood in relation to the larger social and economic arrangements that put individuals and populations in harm's way, leading to both premature illness and death. Police violence is a striking reflection of our American legacy of racism, a system that assigns value and structures opportunity while unfairly advantaging some and disadvantaging others based simply on their skin color. On Friday, your AMA board voted unanimously to approve an important statement on racism. We also developed a video that we wanted to share that further demonstrates our commitment to address racism. As leaders in medicine, we hope that you will all join the AMA in affirming these values.
We, the Board of Trustees,
state that
the AMA recognizes that racism
in its systemic, structural,
institutional,
and interpersonal forms
is an urgent threat to public health,
the advancement of health equity,
and a barrier to excellence in delivery of medical care.
The AMA opposes all forms of racism.
The AMA denounces police brutality
and all forms
of racially motivated violence.
The AMA will actively work
to dismantle racist
and discriminatory policies and practices
across all of healthcare.
All of healthcare.
All of healthcare.
Okay, and now next we'll have Dr. Brian Swan, who will frame our discussion for today.
Good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to say that in this framing, I want to touch upon a few points. Some of them are quite personal. I would say, first of all, to preface this, that not all police are bad, but often things change when people run in pairs or in groups. From my experiences, it seems that sometimes one attitude often fuels the other. And at that junction, it's a toss-up in terms of which direction things will go. Having been arrested 4 times and pulled over several other times, it came from some experiences such as driving a nice car, late at night, being well-spoken or well-dressed, talking too much, trying to have a discussion about what is taking place and why. The hue, light or dark skin complexion that one might have. Your physical features, tall, short, muscular, overweight, or your negroid features. Your education or your job. And then fear that accompanies the issues between a man's spiritual, physical power, and egos often play a role. These are factors that came into play several years ago when my 2 brothers and a cousin and I were stopped and questioned by the police in San Francisco. That resulted to being beaten in the street, arrested, walked through a gauntlet and beaten in an alley, beaten in the alley again, squeezing of our genitals as a part of the search, and then processed. And then to watch my youngest brother, a future Hall of Famer, beaten in the knees with billy clubs. And after 4 hours of torture, it was suggested they would be taken out and killed. This, by no means, is a different world. And to talk about it on the surface without being on the inside is totally different and sometimes seems unbelievable. On several occasions, we were specifically called by the names of nigger, monkeys, and aborigines, repeatedly by more than one officer. My brother and I were rearrested after the preliminary hearings. The pain of that, watching my mother cry, and my father being held in contempt of court when they spoke out about hearing the details of these injustices. I was in dental school. Another one of us was being chosen that night, same night, to be the #1 pick of a football team in the NFL. And the others were college students, fathers, and husbands. 3 months of trial being accused for assault and battery with a deadly weapon against a police officer, unable to go to work or to dental school in class. 10 years total, including a lawsuit and appeals, is what it took. Thinking about these underlying circumstances, trauma, the legal fees, reputations, fear of appraisals, and the power of a support system all come into play. Within the fraternity of policing, we often find camaraderie or a gang-like tendencies fueled by racial stereotypes, fueled by hatred, envy, ego, miseducation, mental illness, power, control, greed, and policies. So we ask, is police violence more prevalent today than it was in the past? How does mental health come into play, and how is everyone affected? And what is the value of reform, integration, and good policing in our communities? Thank you. Dr. Williams?
I don't think we can hear you, Dr. Williams.
Sorry about that. Our first speaker will be Dr. Canna Cooper, who will be talking with us about the history and evolution of policing in the United States.
Well, thank you all so much. I'm honored to be with you today and to be on this panel. I wish that we could all be together in person, and I very much look forward to the day that we can be together. I'm going to be talking with you today about the history of policing and how we got to the militarized kind of policing that we have, a militarized kind of policing that's responsible for so much racialized violence. Before I begin, I need to report a conflict of interest. I identify as non-Hispanic white, and I'm descended from people who enslaved other people. We committed these crimes against humanity, both in New York State and also in Virginia. The painting that you see here in front of you is of my great-great-great-grandmother. She's in a house in upstate New York. And in back is a man named Mr. Joseph Stewart. Mr. Stewart was one of many people that my family enslaved over centuries. And after this picture was painted, he freed himself. My family's heritage, along with present day manifestations of white supremacy, they've given me a wealth and a power that have been forcibly taken from other people. One of the implications of this is that try as I might to engage in anti-racist work, I still have a vested interest in maintaining white supremacy, right? So I will have to relinquish wealth and power to end it. And so I caution you as you listen to me today for the next few minutes to listen to me with some skepticism, right? Ask yourself what I might be unable or unwilling to see or to understand because of this history and my present. Think about how white supremacy and the ways that I benefit from it might limit or distort my perspective and my remarks. So I ask that you listen to me critically. All right, so let's turn to the history of policing in this country. So I'm going to be arguing two things today. So first, that over the centuries, policing has been forged by cycles of state oppression and community resistance. And second, that the specific nature of policing in any given time and place is shaped in part by the specific nature of community resistance. So those are the two arguments I'm going to be making. I'm going to try to illustrate these premises with one historical example, and then I'll turn to today's war on drugs policing. That's a kind of policing that's producing so much brutality. And I'll start with slave patrols in the United States. So slave patrols were the first formal government-sponsored police forces in the US colonies. And they were established to help create and maintain our emerging racialized social system. We all know in our bones what a racialized social system is because we live it every day in this country. In a system like ours, economic, political, social, and psychological rewards and penalties are parsed out along socially constructed racial lines. This system supports white supremacy, which is the systematic positioning of white people above all other racial ethnic groups. Benia Silva offers a great discussion of racialized social systems if you want to learn more about it from an academic perspective. Now, our racialized social system in the US started with chattel slavery, and that's one of the most extreme forms of a racialized social system that's possible. During the 16 decades that slave patrols existed, they played an instrumental role in the state's formation of this extreme racialization, protecting white supremacy in the face of continuous resistance by enslaved people. As I'm sure you all know, chattel slavery deprived enslaved people of political and civil rights. The only legally recognized relationship that an enslaved person could have was to the person who claimed to own them. Parents had no rights over their children, marriages were not recognized, and the wealth that enslaved people created belonged entirely to these putative owners. And enslaved people were also prohibited from gathering without a white person present. Now, in the midst of this systematic brutalization, enslaved people found multiple ways to resist. They forged vital ties with one another, some defined by blood, some by love. These ties were a form of daily resistance. It was vital to sustaining people's lives and their spirit and culture. They created multiple strategies to personally profit from their own work. They hired themselves out to other plantations to work for wages, and sometimes cultivated their own plots by their homes and sold crops to local markets. Although they were forbidden from gathering without a white person present, enslaved communities created multiple traditions over time that routinely brought them together, including worship services, celebrations, and also councils to resolve disputes. And then, of course, people escaped, right? Often to maroon communities or to free colonies. They also engaged in uprisings led by people whose names we all should have grown up learning, like Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, and Nat Turner. Slave patrols were created to end this resistance. So the patrols were made up of about 5 white men, and their patrol strategies were rooted in the very nature of enslaved people's resistance and rebellion. So the resistance of enslaved people usually had a spatial component, and in particular usually required leaving the plantation. So families, for example, were often geographically separated. A daughter might be sold away from her parents to another plantation, or a will might bequeath an enslaved husband to one son and his enslaved wife to another. So maintaining kinship relationships usually meant leaving one's plantation and traveling along public roads to see your family, to maintain those ties. Similarly, selling one's harvest in a market or attending a celebration or a religious service typically meant leaving home and traversing the local roads into town or to another plantation. So as a result, slave patrols spent their days and nights traveling along the roads that linked one plantation to another and to the towns, and stopping every person on those roads who looked like they might be enslaved to confirm whether they had permission from their legal owner to be away from home. When patrols discovered resistance, they were empowered to physically punish that person and were required to return them to their home plantation. And because enslaved people were legally considered property, there were limits set on the amount of physical violence that patrollers could inflict on their victims to ensure that the punishments didn't interfere with the enslaved individual's ability to work. These patrols lasted up through the Civil War, so over 160 years. And this means that the US has had these patrols in place for several years longer than it has not. Now, normally I would next discuss the development of the Peeler police force in Ireland when it was part of the British Empire, but I'll skip that today in the interest of time. But if you want to learn more, Dr. Mindy Full-Love and I have done our best to write about the Peelers in our book. And just suffice to say that the English created the Peeler police to occupy Ireland, and their job was to replace a standing army in that colony when that army became too expensive to maintain. And the police were then supposed to suppress rebellions and further the process of racializing Irish Catholic communities. And just back then, and actually up until quite recently, the Irish were not considered white. The peelers explicitly linked police to the military, and they're actually where we get our militarized police uniforms, or where we get the rankings of sergeant and lieutenants within the police force. And they're also where we get that quasi-military training that we see within police forces. So we imported that from Ireland into the United States. So next, though, I want to fast forward to the 1900s and to the war on drugs and its related policing. So here, policing is supporting something that Mindy Fullilove has called American Apartheid Capitalism. And by American Apartheid Capitalism, she means that in the United States, capitalism and racism have formed an economic system that continuously siphons resources toward a small cadre of wealthy white elites and creates and reinforces racial ethnic divisions to suppress resistance by a unified working class. And I want to step back to the early to mid 1900s to understand why war on drugs policing was needed to maintain our racialized social system during these years. So the early to mid 1900s saw tremendous advances in social, political, and economic rights in the United States. So unions made great strides towards ensuring economic security for the working class. The mid-century civil rights movement claimed political, economic, and social rights for Black people. We changed our laws to protect voting and to protect people from discrimination based on their race in employment, in education, and in housing. Overall, we saw marked legal changes taking us toward equality and away from the Jim Crow era, which had explicitly enshrined inequality in US law. Now, just as during slavery, these advances towards equality called forth an oppressive response from the state, seeking to roll back these advances. We embarked on a massive urban renewal program, which displaced hundreds of thousands of families, most of whom were Black. These displacements severed social networks. They undermined cultural, social, political, and economic capital. They created emotional turmoil as people lost their homes and their neighborhoods on a massive scale. Mindy Fullilove has written about this displacement really eloquently in her book called Root Shock, if you'd like to take a look at that. During this time, unions were undermined, as were employment and economic rights, and we also suffered the large-scale shift of resources from communities and social programs to the military, and that's something that persists. War on drugs policing was a part of this oppressive response. So this kind of policing is characterized by the deployment of massive numbers of uniformed and undercover officers who are exclusively or almost exclusively dedicated to addressing street-level drug-related offenses. It's also characterized by large-scale expanses of police funding to support those deployments, and by expanding police powers to permit intrusive and often violent tactics that historically the US Constitution has prohibited. Now, war on drugs policing primarily targets Black and Latinx people and also impoverished, predominantly Black and Latinx urban neighborhoods. Reflecting its roots in these neighborhoods, policing is highly militarized and violent, and police deploy relentless stop and frisk, SWAT teams, and other war on drugs tactics against civilians. Where the civil rights movement has focused on changing laws, the war on drugs focused on racializing enforcement of supposedly race-neutral laws, right? So that's the strategy that effectively shifted racial ethnic discrimination from the letter of the law to the streets and constitutes de facto discrimination in a context in which de jure discrimination is no longer possible or as possible as it has been. This racialized enforcement has introduced extraordinary violence into predominantly Black and Latinx neighborhoods, making it very difficult for these communities to mobilize and organize resistance. So if you cannot stop and hug a neighbor, talk to a neighbor on the street for fear of having the police interpret that exchange as a drug deal, it's very difficult to mobilize your community politically. In addition, war on drugs policing is the gateway to mass incarceration. And mass incarceration, and in particular felonies, have been crucial to rolling back the rights that Black people gained in the last century. So for example, landlords can refuse to house someone if they have a felony on their record, no matter how old that conviction is. Employers can legally refuse to hire someone who has a felony. Welfare offices can refuse entitlements to people with these records. And of course, people with felony records are prohibited from voting in many states. So because of the racialization of the war on drugs, these rollbacks of rights fall disproportionately on Black people, and they've successfully undermined the gains that were, many of the gains that were achieved in the 1900s. So that's the premise here, that oppression begets resistance, which in turn brings forth the police. And we see this in the US colonies. We see this in today's war on drugs. And also the specific nature of the resistance helps to shape the police that were created to squash that resistance. So enslaved people resisted in part by leaving their plantations to visit family, to make money, and to worship. And so slave patrols monitored roadways. War on drugs policing and mass incarceration have very effectively rolled back many of the social, political, and economic gains that were won in the last century. So that's a whirlwind discussion of racialized policing in the US. I'm looking forward to your questions and to reflecting with you on this history. And I'm delighted now to pass the microphone on to Dr. Turner Davis, who will discuss the public health ramifications of our present day policing strategies.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Cooper. And thank you, Dr. Williams, Dr. Hodges, Dr. Fleming, Dr. Reede, and the Health Symposium, and our fellow Commonwealth Fellows. It's just an honor to be here to discuss this very important and relevant topic. I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully. Okay, there we go. So I'm Dr. Shayuri Turner. I'm the Chief Transformation Officer for Crisis Text Line. I am an internist and pediatrician by training, and I'm going to be discussing the impact of policing encounters on physical and mental health. As we're all aware, our bodies store many things for us, and the experiences of people of color in particular carry the load of both the experiences, personal experiences, and experiences of others within our bodies. So I show this for a particular reason. First, on the left is the beating of Rodney King, March 31st, 1991. And on the right is the often seen recently murder of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin on May 25th, 2020. We're looking at these images for two reasons. One, for us personally to investigate and elevate what our physical and emotional responses are to these images. And two, to show the difference, the span of time. Personally, the beating of Rodney King was a true inflection point for our country, because the experiences up until that point of Black and Brown people were often not narrated accurately when it came to police reports. And there was the sentiment and the belief that if the rest of the country could only actually visually witness what we'd been experiencing for centuries, something different and some change and reform would come through the police and through law enforcement's actions. But for those who are familiar with Rodney King and his beating, that did not occur. There was no reckoning around the occurrences there, where, as you see, multiple law enforcement officers are beating him while he's prone on the ground. And then fast forward 30 years to George Floyd. Different only in the fact that there was a national and international reckoning and recognition that as humans, we did not accept this and we did not support this, and we expect better of our law enforcement officers, and we were not willing to accept, and we were joined by people of all races and nationalities across the nation and across the world. So a 30-year span of time difference, it still remains to be seen what true and structural changes will occur, if any, secondary to the verdict against Derek Chauvin. But again, I ask you to reflect on what each of these images bring up for you physically and emotionally. For me personally, and for many, it creates a stress. And in a very simplistic way, stress is when our expectations are not met with an aligned reality. So as you can see from these images and these pictures, people of color are protesting, are being victimized, are being erased. And that is not the expectation that we have as citizens of the United States. So for each of us, no matter what our historic experience, existing within the United States as a white dominant culture does not provide for us an expectation, a reality that aligns with our expectations for our citizenship here in the US. What is trauma? Because when we talk about the physical and mental health effects of policing, and particularly police brutality, it's important to distinguish between stress, which can be sort of a shorter term experience for the body, right? So looking at those images, many people might say my heart rate increased, I felt anxious, or I felt angry. Trauma is when an individual trauma results from an event or a series of events or set of circumstances that's experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So it's that trauma makes those changes where the impact is holistically on the body. It's a stress response due to a situation, but the trauma sits deeply within us. So the images that we've all become familiar with around George Floyd and so many others are actually traumas that we are, as people of color in particular, are imbibing and storing in our being. So what are some of the longer term, immediate versus long-term responses to stress? So an immediate stressor can be an interaction with law enforcement, whether it's seemingly regular interaction where it's a ticket, you receive a ticket and you're on your way, or it's as Dr. Swan so eloquently described his horrific experiences, where it's a lengthy traumatic event. So the immediate response that our body feels with a stressor or a trauma is the activation of the cortisol, the HPA, hypothalamic pituitary axis, and the production, adrenal axis, and the production of cortisol, which is our fight or flight hormone, which causes our heart rate to elevate, respiratory rate to elevate, blood pressure, muscles tighten, become intensely focused. It's the fight or flight response, and it's what our body does in a situation of danger, and that's a normal response. But when one sits with long-term, repeated, or even low-level trauma and low-level stress, which I would offer most people of color existing in the United States experience through racism, a chronic and then acute on chronic stress. and trauma. So the long-term effects wear on our bodies: headaches, risk of cardiac events, hypertension, stomach and GI problems, decreased immune system, increased blood sugar, depression, anxiety, insomnia, dementia. So when you think about the combination of the pandemic and the racial unrest that existed, it's not a surprise when we know that people of color are also have such health disparities, that we see the rates of death during the pandemic, because it's an overlay of an acute stress on a chronic stress on chronic conditions. So what is unique about the stress of the BIPOC experience with law enforcement? And I say BIPOC as Black, Indigenous, people of color, because we may not see everything broadcast, but we have Indigenous people who have been purposefully erased in terms of the history that they've endured in this country. Our Asian American brothers and sisters, and our Latinx brothers and sisters, and others who are here in this country who endure experiences with the police and law enforcement that are not always favorable. So what's unique about that? It's the historic racism. Each of us who have been stolen and brought to this country or immigrated to this country experienced the historic racism that Dr. Cooper began to describe. Then there's the structural and systemic racism, where the laws and the policies have been built into the system to support and uphold racism for in all areas. So we look at it, we call it health disparities in medicine. That is just the infusion of racism in medicine. We call it disproportionate minority contact. That is the infusion of racism in the juvenile justice and criminal justice setting. So we really have to see the groundwater effect of racism and how it has been built into this country since its inception. What else is unique? The collective versus the individual. People of color, especially, I can speak as a Black woman, we live in the collective. Our experiences about the collective, about our traditions, our heritage, our existence is almost requires us to live as a collective protectively. So when we see anyone experiencing police brutality or having an untoward experience with law enforcement, that hits us personally, because we know that it could be us, it could be our son, it could be our daughter, it could be anyone in our family, and that we actually, again, have that stress response, witnessing repeatedly these events with law enforcement that we see so frequently now. Which gets me to repeated exposures. Back when, in the times when Dr. Cooper was discussing the history, these stories were passed on verbally to try to protect people of color by passing along what the situations were, so that if there was any way to stay safe, we were passing those stories along. Then we got to the era where images were shared. Emmett Till, we still see the horrific murder of Emmett Till's, those images that came forward that his mother provided and ensured that the news media published. And now it's through video, which actually, especially for our children, is this repeated imprinting of these devastating images onto the mind and into the body, setting us up for triggers, which basically says you can be in a certain situation in the present and something, a smell, a taste, a vision, reminds you of a past traumatic experience, and your response to it is heightened and elevated as if you were in that previous situation. And again, what is unique, the fight, flight, or freeze, when people encounter law enforcement, sometimes the triggers and the visions and the remembrances and the images from social media create a heightened stress response even before the situation actually unfolds. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a disorder that really, after a series of traumas where that have been shocking, scary, dangerous, it creates a hypervigilance and a feeling of being traumatized repeatedly, and the triggers are ever present. We hear about this often with veterans, but it exists for children who've been traumatized, and it exists for those of us who've watched and experienced traumas out in the communities. So what happens? What's a complex post-traumatic stress disorder? What are the symptoms? Avoidance of thoughts or memories, hypervigilance, re-experiencing, so nightmares, flashbacks. If for people who have been experienced the police in a negative way, those flashbacks can be ever present. An altering of attention and memory, emotional dysregulation, interpersonal instability, an impact on the belief systems as diminished, defeated, or worthless. And then, of course, the somatic symptoms, the physical and the psychological overwhelming feelings and emotions. These are a couple of studies. You know, there's not a great deal out there. There's starting to be more, but not a great deal out there on the public health effects and the physical and mental health effects, specifically of encounters with law enforcement. This study was the elevated prevalence of suicide attempts among victims of police violence in the US. And what it showed was that the odds of suicide attempt were greatly increased for these respondents in 4 US cities who reported assaultive forms of violence and victimization. So physical victimization with a weapon was the worst, and then sexual victimization by law enforcement. And unfortunately, this isn't super clear, but what this is showing you is that people who have experienced trauma are at a heightened risk of 15 times more likely to commit suicide, a heightened risk of alcoholism, sexually transmitted diseases, use of antidepressants, depression, obesity, job problems. All of these, and these can be childhood traumas that then can be exacerbated by adult traumatic situations, but all of these contribute to physical and mental health conditions that are detrimental to individuals, and particularly people of color. Another study looked at aggressive policing and the mental health of young urban men, and this was in New York City. Men 18 to 26, they reported more police, participants who reported more police contact, reported more trauma and anxiety symptoms associated to how many stops they reported, and the intrusiveness of the encounters, and the perception of fairness. There's nothing worse than feeling disempowered and denied your rights when you know fundamentally that you have not done anything wrong. This last study, Keeping Your Guard Up, it explored hypervigilance among urban residents affected by community and police violence, and the exposure to police violence was associated with a 9.8% increase in hypervigilance score, and nearly twice that associated with exposure to community violence, which was a 5.5% increase. So these traumatic events do affect the hypervigilance, and by hypervigilance we mean when your body is on alert when there's absolutely nothing going on. So after these interactions and exposures, people were still constantly in this fight or flight mode. Looking here again at the impacts of trauma, because that's really how we have to characterize the effects of mental and physical effects of negative experiences with law enforcement. There's reenactment in the mind, loss of self-worth, dissociation. It is truly a mind, body, and spirit disaster for folks who have experienced trauma in this way. And this actually is not just for, this relates to all types of trauma, including childhood trauma. So as we look at this and we sit here today and discuss, I would offer as a physician these necessary considerations for police reform, right? when the police are looking at ways to explore and to prevent the impact that they're having on the communities of color, there has to be a recognition that everything that I described previously, as far as triggers and physiologic and psychological and emotional responses to trauma, is exactly what is being experienced by police every day. So are we, as a country, adequate in protection of our citizens, are we adequately exploring situations and the triggers that exist for law enforcement in these situations? Because to go out every day and to risk your life to protect and serve is a risk that can be carried in the body. That too is a stressor. There's the fear of unknown situations, but when you combine that with an implicit bias, that is when we see decision-making that is appears to be based on race and not the actual situation at hand. We have to normalize mental health support for law enforcement daily, because everything that is experienced in the line of duty, the encounters with death, the encounters with life, having to save lives, witnessing people dying, all of those things create stress and trauma for the police officers as well. Looking at private mental health counseling versus behavioral science units that exist within the law enforcement offices within the police stations, private mental health counseling allows that separation between work and the support services. Mobile crisis units are coming into, hopefully very soon, really going to be embraced for our nation and funded for our nation, so that a law enforcement officer would have the support as needed for so many people who wind up being mentally ill, do not need to be arrested, but where there's no other support for law enforcement. The mobile crisis units are just an opportunity that we cannot let pass us by. And lastly, on behalf of my organization, Crisis Text Line, which is a 24/7 volunteer-run crisis intervention service, run solely on a text platform, so it's completely anonymous and private. That is both a resource for individuals, anyone can text in, but it should also be seen as a resource for law enforcement officers. We have to look at this holistically. We cannot be divided on this, because our people of color in particular, we must find a solution here. We have not seen the end of this tension between people of color and law enforcement. We have not seen an end at this point. So it is up to us and important for us to look at all angles on solving this situation, because we will be here. We are continuing to be more and more of a country of color, and we have to recognize and support ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Turner. We'll next hear from Barry Friedman, who will discuss reimagining policing reform. Dr. Barry Friedman.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Williams. I'm very, very glad to be here. There's some construction going on outside, so I'm sorry that we're not in person, and I'm particularly sorry for that. I am very appreciative of the invitation to speak with you today. The policing work that we're doing is incredibly busy, and I've had to curtail most of my speaking, but I think it's so very important to understand that policing is a public health crisis, and that we need to deal with it in those ways. And so I'm very glad to be here. My early work was around the judiciary, and it was always good to go to a conference in which there were a lot of judges, because I could call everybody by the same first name, which was Judge. Later, when I was working in policing, everybody had the same first name, Chief. And now I'm in a room where many people have the same first name, Doctor, but I know all of you do not. So I may at times revert to first names, and you should feel free to do that for me as well. I am the founding director of the Policing Project at NYU School of Law. And when it comes to our work, there are really two sides to our house. First, there is work around reducing the footprint of policing, making sure that police are not going to situations to which they are not well suited and to avoiding the harm that follows from policing. And then the other side of our work is controlling policing to the extent that policing exists and with regard to the functions that the police perform. I want to talk to you about the first primarily because that's consistent with the theme of the gathering today, to talk about the extent to which policing affects public health and what to do about it from a public health perspective. But I actually want to start with the first and take you on the journey that I went on, because I think you'll find it interesting in terms of understanding what it is we all need to do to tackle the problems around policing today. So I'm kind of the odd person out at this gathering. I'm a constitutional law professor. And though I've taught criminal procedure, the course that deals with how the law treats policing for many decades now, I came to the kind of work that I do somewhat late. In 2006, a light bulb went off in my head about why we had the problems with policing that we do. I'll explain the light bulb in just a moment. And I wrote a book called Unwarranted Policing Without Permission. That subtitle's important, Policing Without Permission. And that caused me, after both the Snowden disclosures about the government spying on all of us, and then the events around Michael Brown's killing and in Ferguson, the protests, to start the policing project. And when I started the policing project, my concern was the same in terms of the effects that many people have discussed today, which was the stops and frisks, the searches, the surveillance, the police killings, the excessive uses of force. And I really brought to it a constitutional law professor's lens, the one that had never really been brought to policing, and that's this idea of how to control policing. So let me say just one word about that to take us on our journey. So we hear the words accountability all the time around policing, and the light bulb that went off in my head is that when we talk about accountability in the policing context, we actually mean something completely different than in all the rest of government. And I think because this is a public health convening, this will resonate with all of you. So in terms of policing, whenever we hear people talk about accountability, something has already gone wrong. And the hope is to hold somebody or an institution, but usually an officer, responsible. And that involves criminal prosecutions and civil rights actions, and for police departments and their cities, federal investigations and federal monitors. If you stop and think about it, even body cameras are a form of this kind of hold somebody responsible after something has happened. And we call that back-end accountability. But in all the rest of government, accountability doesn't only happen on the back end. In fact, it primarily happens on the front end, which is to say, we try to avoid bad things from happening in the first place altogether. And the way that we do that is that we adopt laws, procedures, policies, protocols. We do them transparently and publicly. We do them with public input. And again, consistent with your own mission, we try to do them in a way that creates more good than harm. So some form of benefit cost analysis. And what I realized is we just don't do that around policing. Long ago, most policing agencies were chartered to enforce the law, keep the peace, maintain order, and given very, very little instruction on how to do any of that. And that was in a day before we had many of our modern weapons and our technologies. And along that time, we've simply let the police decide for themselves how they are going to police society. And that, I think, is a serious error, and founded the Policing Project to try to bring front-end accountability to policing. And we still do a great deal of work. For example, we are working on a set of model statutes, 3 of which I could describe later if there was interest, but would have avoided, if they had been adopted in the state of Minnesota, the killing of Dante Wright. And so this kind of front-end accountability, I think, is absolutely essential, and we have never tried it in this country, and we need to do that. However, here's my personal journey. The Policing Project works with all stakeholders. So we will happily join at the table, bring to the table anyone who wants to work together to make policing different and better than it is, and public safety in particular. And I'll come to the public safety aspect in just a moment. And that means that we work in impacted communities. We do that in cities in many places in the country. We work with police departments. When we're working with surveillance issues, we work with technology companies. But it's an all stakeholders approach. It doesn't mean the stakeholders all work together, but we often are in the middle of all that. And so I spent several years both working in impacted communities, but also working with police departments, riding around in police cars, in the command rooms of police headquarters. And as I did that work, and as my teams did that work, I came to understand that I had in some ways fundamentally misdiagnosed the problem. That although it's certainly true, and I am resolute that we need to do front-end regulation of policing, that the harms of policing followed not only because of a failure to regulate policing, but because we were just asking police to do all kinds of things that it was ridiculous, frankly, to ask them to do. And that led to a bunch of research that I did, and ultimately to an article I had finished writing, a very long law review article, so I wouldn't trouble any of you with it, but there's a Wall Street Journal, very short version of it that might interest you because it refers to emergency medicine as a metaphor, that I had finished about 2 months before George Floyd was killed. And I thought my argument was futuristic. I'll tell you the argument in just a minute, but after George Floyd was killed, the country kind of exploded with interest about the very thing I'm going to describe. So as part of my research, what I did was I went and looked at police training. I created little pie charts for different agencies in terms of the amount of time they spent learning about different sets of skills. And what I learned was, in addition to the things you would think the police would be trained in terms of, how to work the radio and how does the sort of the administrative aspect of policing work, police are trained primarily in two things: the use of force and the use of the law enforcement. And what they're not trained so much on are things like dispute resolution or mediation, social services availability, social services diagnosis, the need for social services, any emergency medical care. Very often police don't have that sort of training. And so I then lined up the training that the police get from what they're actually called to do, looking at data on calls for service or responses that people are, including social scientists who have sort of observed police patrols, the kinds of responses that are called for. So, police very rarely show up at a scene where there's a crime in progress. And what they get asked to do throughout the day are a host of things. Some of them are behavioral issues with substance use or mental illness. We've heard a lot about that in the news, though that is actually a relatively small part of the calls for police. It's a bunch of other stuff. Animals, cats in a tree, neighbor's dog is barking. It's disputes. Somebody's angry about the noise from a party next door. Or there's a domestic disagreement. Domestic disagreements and domestic violence calls are a large part of what the police are asked to deal with. It's welfare checks. Somebody's worried about the elderly neighbor downstairs. It's burglar alarms, most of which, the vast majority of which, turn out to be false alarms. And what I came to realize was that the police were extremely ill-suited to deal with the vast majority of what they were called to do all day long. And not only were they ill-suited, but it stands to reason that if you send force and law to deal with a problem that's not best dealt with force and law, you're still likely to get force and law. And much of the harm that we see in society is because of what I view as a mismatch between what we call upon the police to do and what they are actually equipped to do. And that got me thinking about what we at the Policing Project now call reimagining public safety, which is what are the ways that we can eliminate that situation. So in my work, I disaggregate the policing function. I look at all the skill sets that one might need to deal with the kinds of calls that the police actually get throughout the day. And then I look at models to see that we could get the help to folks that they actually need, that impacted communities in particular would get the help that they require, and people in those communities. We often hear that people call the police, but that's not true. They call 911, which is an emergency line that we've told them to call, and we send the police. And so the question is, what alternative is there? So there actually are a limited number of choices, and I'm going to run down them quickly. We could train the police better so that they have a broader range of skills. We could do co-response, where we send the police along with another responder, be it somebody who's trained in dispute resolution or somebody who's got expertise in how to deal with mental health issues. We could get the police out of the picture and just send alternative responders to these situations. And so that's kind of the range. And in terms of those responders, they could be embedded with the police, or they could be in separate agencies. And that's kind of what we need to do. Along the way, though, I want to add one twist, and then I'll talk about the work we're doing, which is I came to understand that even though what we really need are specialists to deal with all these problems, and we do need specialists to deal with many of the problems to which the police are called, initially we need generalist first responders. What we need, and here's my analogy to emergency rooms, is people who can show up, stabilize the situation, fix it if they can, and if not, call in long-term resources to ultimately solve the problem. Because what you hear in policing all the time is that the police get called time and time again to the same address because the problem there is never solved, whatever the problem is. And that's expensive, and it leads to long-term trouble and not long-term solutions. So our goal at the Policing Project, and I think the goal of other organizations, and has to be the goal of the country, is to figure out how to provide the services to impacted communities that they need in a way that avoids the harm and difficulty of policing. Now, what we've done is we've embarked in a nationwide project that is in large part a learning exercise, the end result of which is going to be to create a template for jurisdictions on how they can transition from the model of public safety that we have now, which usually just means policing, to a broader conception of public safety that means getting the services to folks that they really need and avoiding the harm of bringing force and law where it is not apt to a situation. And we're doing that by walking through basically 6 steps, and I'll just briefly sketch them out. First, we've been listening to folks in impacted communities and to the police to see what they both make of calls for defunding the police and abolition, and to see if there's common ground. And we have found a lot of common ground. In fact, the truth is the police themselves feel like they're not equipped to deal with a lot of things to which they're called. Second, we're trying to learn both quantitatively and qualitatively why people call 911, why they call for help, what are the needs in the communities where most of the calls come from, so that we can understand what are the proper responses. Third, we're trying to learn from this extraordinary natural experiment that landed upon us a year or so ago, first with COVID and second with the protests after the killing of George Floyd. Because one of the things you hear anywhere you travel in the country and talk to the police is that officers spend their entire day running from radio call to radio call, never catching up, never getting ahead of the radio, never having time to interact with the community, and often not using their time well. And the natural response is to say, so stop doing it. But the police will tell you we can't. Everybody expects us to respond. Except the interesting thing is that in the face of COVID and in the protests, many agencies actually did stop responding, or at least responding in person. So we're trying to learn what those alternate responses were. Then we're investigating risk. There's this mantra in dispatch centers, when in doubt, send them out, meaning that the default position is to send the police. And the question is that default right? What are the risks of sending the police? What are the risks of not sending the police? What are the risks of sending alternative responders? So we're going to talk to folks in mayor's offices and corporation council, impacted communities, the police, dispatchers to understand how do we assess risk. Goal 5 is to build a template that jurisdictions can use to transition from the world that we're in now to a different world. That is not going to be easy work. We've paired up to work with groups like the Government Finance Officers Association, which is not a group I thought I'd be working with, but turns out budgets and finance are really, really important. And a panel of national experts in a lot of fields like first response, dispatch, the police, public health, to figure out what are all the questions that need to be answered and the problems that need to be solved to move to a different way of doing business. Then we're going to take a deep dive in 2 or 3 jurisdictions and see how that template would apply to those jurisdictions. And following that, we will release both a report, but also we hope along the way to conduct webinars and training sessions and release all of our materials along the way publicly so that people can try this in their own jurisdictions. And then finally, our goal 5 is a moonshot, which is not at all funded at the present, but is to actually reimagine first response entirely. So in my world, there would be cars that drove around the city that said on them, not police, but first. Maybe their motto would be, help is here, or we've come to help. And the individuals in those cars would be trained with a wide range of skills, like dispute resolution and the ability to diagnose social problems and what availability there are for social services and some basic EMS training, and see if we can't stabilize situations by using these first responders. And that would require completely rethinking what first response looks like, including, I'm sort of intrigued at the idea of a 4-year degree. My colleague suggested it would be like maybe like ROTC, where people could be funded to get the 4-year degree and then owe back 5 years working in public safety response. So that's the idea. That's our work. I've been very honored to speak with you all today, and I look forward to hearing more into the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barry. Our next speaker is Council Member Cunningham.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Philippe Cunningham, and I am a Minneapolis City Council member, and I represent the 4th Ward, which is in North Minneapolis. Just pulling up my screen here to be able to share. All right. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Great. All right. So, again, hi, everyone. My name is Philippe Cunningham. And as was mentioned when I was first introduced, I'm a Minneapolis City Council member and the chair of the city's Public Health and Safety Committee. I'm very honored to be here. We are definitely ground zero here in Minneapolis for the conversation around not only police violence, but also reimagining public safety more broadly. So today I'm here to talk to you about exactly that from a local government perspective. Local government, that perspective is particularly critical in this conversation because policing in our country, as it has been mentioned, is very unique in the United States. There are about 18,000 independently operating law enforcement agencies in our country. So that means that the local level is the most important level when it comes to policing and public safety more broadly. And this is why I will be talking more broadly about public safety, building out comprehensive systems of public safety and how transformed policing fits within that ecosystem. I will be giving some specific examples and share some reference materials for folks who are big nerds like me, which I think many of you are, to dig into further after today's event. But first, we need to have an operational definition of violence. So according to Dr. Bandy Lee, violence is the intentional or threatened human action, either direct or through structural neglect and diminution of others that results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in human deprivation, injury, or death, or contributes to the extinction of the human race. I'm sorry, human species. So, whoa, that's a really big, heavy definition, but what makes it important and why I bring it up here is because it's inclusive of the different typologies of violence, which include self-directed, interpersonal, collective, and just as an aside, collective suicidal behavior mostly relates to our destruction of the planet that we live on and thus self-destruction. And then violence to the planet itself and structural violence, which actually is the deadliest form of violence. It's critical to understand violence typologies because interventions are differentiated between them. Today, we will be focusing here on building comprehensive public safety systems aimed to disrupt the cycle of interpersonal violence in particular. And as you can see here, interpersonal includes community violence, family violence, and police violence. Lastly, core to the public health approach to public safety, which is what I strongly advocate for us to shift our paradigm of public safety, including policing to be able to be oriented to, is that the concept of violence is a disease that spreads. It spreads between the same typologies, so that means gun violence resulting in more gun violence, and between typologies. Dr. Turner actually spoke to an example of intertypology violence spreading by evidence of a connection between police violence and suicide. Like many other infectious diseases, however, violence can be prevented, treated, and cured. By building systems based on the public health approach to public safety, we are focused on developing and institutionalizing interventions that disrupt the spread of violence. And the reason why it is very critical for us to be having this conversation as we're talking more broadly about policing violence is because by building out comprehensive systems, we are shrinking the footprint of police as the only form of public safety in our cities. And it lowers the likelihood of negative interactions between community members and the police. Now, when I'm talking about comprehensive systems of public safety, my recommendation is for us to focus on 4 main pillars. Alternative responses, which Dr. Freeman just spoke to, which are unarmed specialized responses to specific types of 911 calls for service. Violence prevention and intervention, which is really the operationalization of the public health approach to public safety. Transforming policing, which is leveraging crime science and criminological research to build new police operations. And reentry supports, which is having the necessary support networks in place in order to make sure that our neighbors who are coming home from incarceration are set up for success rather than being set up to fail and fall back into the cycle of involvement with crime in the criminal justice system. I will dig into each of these a bit further and try to give some examples and references. So first up, alternative responses. I won't belabor the point because Dr. Freeman did an amazing job doing so already, but these are sometimes called the alternatives to policing, but I think that's actually a fairly limited way of looking at it. I've spoken to officers who have been around for a very long time, veteran officers who have told me that many of these types of calls they were not answering 30 years ago. But what we have seen though is in that time frame, social services have been cut and cut and cut, and we have asked police officers to do more and more and more. They are almost the only government service that's provided 24/7, 365. So if you call 911, more than likely a police officer is coming. But those same police officers know that they're not making the kind of impacts that they know that people need and want. So this is why we need to build out alternative responses. The City of Minneapolis's Office of Performance and Innovation did a citywide survey that netted over 8,000 responses. Within this survey, the issue areas that we see here on the screen are the areas that were identified as priorities for residents to have alternatives to armed police officers. By building out alternative responses, we actually unburden police officers from having to do this work, which is really outside of their purview and training, and provide the appropriate kind of help that people need for their unique circumstances. Next up, we will talk about violence prevention and interventions, which is something I'm particularly nerdy about. This is really where we see the public health approach to public safety in action. While I call this body of work violence prevention and intervention, what we're really talking about here is primarily secondary intervention and primary prevention and tertiary prevention based on risk and protective factors. Primary prevention is upfront approaches that take place before violence has occurred to lay the groundwork that can prevent violence from emerging in the first place. And it really it involves infusing activities into the fabric of society. So this looks like equitable access to stable housing, high quality education, careers with opportunities for growth and work, and that should be focused on everyone. That primary prevention is for everyone. This work is critical, however, it is the work for all of us to do and supports the success of secondary and tertiary work, and those are the areas that we really focus on in violence prevention and intervention. Secondary prevention is early interventions, often at the first sign of risk or as a response to an immediate threat of violence. Violence or associated risk factors are addressed in the early stages, perhaps before any symptoms of violence or its consequences are even apparent. So for example, a risk factor for children is witnessing violence. So building in an intervention in a public health or a public safety system to provide evidence-based therapy for children and families would be an example of secondary prevention. And tertiary prevention is responses after violence has occurred to deal with disrupting the cycle and spread of violence, the lasting consequences of violence, and promoting healing and restoration. I will provide some more specific examples here. For the sake of time, I'll be quick on this, but interventions can be developed for and informed by different levels within the socio-ecological model that we see here, which is individual, interpersonal, organizational, community, public policy, and it can also be based on the biopsychosocial environmental, which is a mouthful, again, brought to us by Dr. Bandy Lee, which is pretty self-explanatory, as you can see here. Some examples of violence prevention and intervention strategies is the group violence intervention strategy, which was created by Dr. David Kennedy, who is now running John Jay College's National Network for Safe Communities. We have hospital-based violence interventions, which I highly recommend folks to look more into. The Health Alliance for Violence Prevention has a lot of really great work and research explaining that. In Minneapolis, our program is called Next Step. And then additionally, pre-charge diversion programs, which is based on key early interventions and someone's involvement in crime in the criminal justice system. And I just want to recommend for folks to, take a look at, if folks are unfamiliar with the public health approach to public safety, Dr. Bandy Lee's violence and interdisciplinary approach to causes, consequences, and cures is a really great starting place. Next, I want to cover transforming policing. So I push back on the notion of reforming policing because so many reforms offered by police leadership and politicians are based on weak to no evidence of effectiveness. It's essentially the equivalent of slapping a coat of paint on a house that's built on a broken foundation. And I talk about this broken foundation because when we talk about policing, that foundation really goes all the way back to slave patrols, as was earlier mentioned as well. So why I advocate for transforming policing is because I believe that we need to be focusing on building a new foundation. What we see here is one of my favorite charts ever because this simple image turns policing completely upside down. As you can see on the bottom left-hand side, our standard model of policing is the least effective way to lower crime and disorder. And it increases the likelihood of negative interactions between police and communities, and it has huge implications for police legitimacy. And even the much touted community policing also has a fairly low effectiveness in being able to improve policing outcomes, improve police legitimacy, improving the relationships between community members and police officers, and the institution of policing more broadly. And as we can see, there are other ways of orienting policing that are highly effective in lowering crime and violence that also increase police legitimacy. And when we have improved legitimacy, that also inherently improves the dynamics between community and police. So as such, I highly recommend, as we are looking at transforming our systems of policing from the ground up, is reorienting our resources that are currently being allocated to highly ineffective strategies that we saw in the previous slide to instead focus on problem-oriented policing, focused deterrence, hotspots policing, and situational crime prevention. These are all based on crime science research, as well as criminological theories and research as well. And again, I have a couple of references here. I'm just focusing on books because there's a ton of articles that I could also share, but there is a really amazing book on case studies, problem-oriented policing case studies by Michael Scott and Ronald Clark, whom are both really pioneers in the field of problem-oriented policing, as well as David Kennedy's book. It focuses a lot on focused deterrence, don't shoot. So I highly recommend, if folks are interested in actually deeply transforming the way that we actually police, here are some strategies that I highly recommend for us to look into. And then last, I want to cover reentry supports. So what we have now when folks are coming out of incarceration is that they are permanently disenfranchised. It is legal to discriminate against people with criminal records in housing, employment, and even in higher education. And so we have completely set up a system in which people get trapped in a cycle of crime, violence, and involvement with the criminal justice system. So a key opportunity for us to be able to have a meaningful intervention is when people are leaving incarceration and we're actually offering them a genuine off-ramp from that cycle. And the way that we can do that is by having housing available. That is one of the biggest things that I hear from folks all the time. In all of the, prevention and intervention, as well as reentry, housing is the biggest issue. And actually here in Minneapolis, we actually changed a policy around landlords being able to do look-backs. So if somebody has, I believe, if I remember correctly, a misdemeanor, that landlords are not able to look at their criminal records beyond 3 years, and for certain felonies after 5 or 7 years. So that way we're able to help people that have criminal records be able to actually secure rental housing in particular. Also, specialized job training connected with jobs with livable wages. And I think a key is connected to the jobs. Job training is really great, but if we're not able to actually channel that into actual employment with livable wages, then folks are going to have to resort back to oftentimes what got them incarcerated in the first place. Case management, having that individualized supports that folks need in order to stay out of a life of crime and violence, that's really individualized, as well as whole family supports. Folks are not in silos off by themselves. They are a part of a broader ecosystem of family. And so, I'll close out here with 2 main points. Throughout the entire 4 pillars that I've spoken of today, what is really important is that we think about how are we doing this work through a public health approach. So as all of you are well aware of, how we actually do the public health approach is thinking about what specifically is the problem. We use the data, the surveillance, the intel gathered by police, by community, and from there we define the problem. We identify what is contributing to this problem. We develop and then test the different strategies, and then we assure the widespread adoption and scaling up to be able to have the level of impact that we're hoping to, the population level impact that we're hoping to achieve. And at any point, if we're testing a prevention strategy or a policing strategy and it's not working, we go back and we continue to do this iterative process that's essentially action research in governing. And then, I'll close out with why should we reimagine public safety through a public health and crime science lens. What we are doing right now is currently not working. It's not keeping particularly BIPOC communities safe across the different typologies of violence. Also, scientifically based approaches that are empirically tested and supported. Why wouldn't we want to invest in those to be able to disrupt our cycles of violence that we're seeing in our community, including, again, police violence? It disrupts the cycle of mass incarceration that we have also been dealing with, and it actually keeps communities safe rather than perpetuating further harm. So that is where I will wrap up with my presentation today. Thank you so much again, and I look forward to digging into conversations and questions and answers. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all panelists for your wonderful presentations. And our viewers, you can type questions to our panelists in the Q&A box. There is one so far from Dr. Turner. And the question is, are police trained, or is further training needed on the impact of trauma on hypervigilance?
So that's a great question. And I think, I apologize, which one of our panelists mentioned the number of different police entities, right? Was that you, Dr. Cooper?
I think that was Councilman Cunningham.
Okay, yes. So the answer is complicated because I think there's variations between different law enforcement based on cities and locations. So I wouldn't have a global answer to that. I don't know if any of our other panelists would. Obviously, there are areas where the understanding of trauma is starting to move into the field of law enforcement, but I will defer to any of the other panelists to see if they have more detailed response.
Anyone? Okay, so we have another question for, this one is also for Dr. Turner. What is the evidence regarding rehabilitation versus punishment programs for justice-involved youth? Is there a national movement to move in that direction?
That too is a great and complicated question that is also tied to different locales. But what I can say, I actually was the chief medical director for the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice from 2005 to 2009. And during that time, we had started to, and the department continues to focus on trauma and trauma-informed practices within the juvenile justice setting. I know of other states that are focusing on trauma-informed practice in juvenile justice and criminal justice settings. So again, we do need these national standards, right? We do need to look to national best practices to help ensure that both children and adults are fully able to be rehabilitated. And so much of it really ties back to childhood trauma and the experiences that adults who are incarcerated, I mean, it's nearly 100% of adults who have been incarcerated have experienced layers, so complex trauma, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect. There's something called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which correlates to incarceration. The higher the number, the greater the likelihood. So it's all connected. And if we're not both digging down to the root of trauma and into the root of structural racism, we're really almost spinning our wheels around mass incarceration and incarceration of children.
Thank you for that. Barry, there's a question about, can you speak to the bills being supported by Congress, specifically the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, and whether or not it will impact local departments?
Sure. So the act is intended to impact local departments in certain ways. I'm not wildly optimistic about its passage. And if it passes, I'm even less optimistic about its chance of effecting real change. One of the problems that we have in this space is that we tend to apply pinpricks to what really are comprehensive problems. So, we look at some of the things that went wrong in policing this spring, and they involved, SWAT raids and no-knock warrants and chokeholds. And so there's lots of legislation to ban no-knock warrants and chokeholds, but the use of force is way more of a problem than that. So here's a quiz I give people all the time when I'm speaking in public, and I'm going to give it to everybody here, but I can't see your hands. I always tell you, you only need 2 hands to do this. You don't even need more than that. Don't need your toes. So tell me, what are the, hold up the number of states in the country that have comprehensive use of force legislation? This would be the right answer. There are none. So that's kind of remarkable, right? That there's no state in the country that's ever passed use of force, comprehensive use of force legislation that regulates what weapons, when they can be used, whether there's an obligation to de-escalate, what reporting there has to be, what kind of investigation there should be, what the public should know. And so we've got one on our website at policingproject.org on the tab about front-end voice or legislation. And we're very eager to see something like that adopted throughout the country. So George Floyd will do, some pinprick good things if pieces of it pass. Another thing we desperately need, and we've got a model statute to deal with this, is demographic reporting on all police encounters. So for all police encounters, the police should let us know what was the basis for the encounter, what was the apparent race and sex of the person they're dealing with, what was the resolution of that matter. Again, the public should know that, but we often don't. So those are the kinds of comprehensive things we need to do, and I'm not optimistic we're going to get them out of Congress.
Thank you. There's a question asking, have any of you looked at under-supporting of public safety in certain communities and ways to better balance the support? So, I guess the example they give is the Alaska Departments of Public Safety at a statewide level, which many communities don't have first responders. I guess that could go to anyone. Maybe, is anyone familiar with that? How about Councilman Cunningham? Are you familiar with any of those?
Yeah, I'm not too familiar. I mean, I live in a big city, so and I'm pretty locally focused, and this is more of a statewide question.
Right.
Yeah, so I apologize. I'm probably not the best person to answer that particular one. I would say though, when there are gaps in Minnesota, typically the Minnesota State Patrol often does fill gaps from time to time in certain rural communities. And their policies and procedures are they're far less rigorous than Minneapolis Police Department. And so I think that there is quite a bit of oversight, lack of oversight related to statewide law enforcement agencies in terms of like policies and procedures. So, so that would be my 2 cents on that particular topic.
Great, thank you.
I would, Dr. Williams,
Go ahead.
would add something just high level. People truly need to pay attention to their state elections. Our federal elections are obviously important, but as Mr. Friedman said in regards to the George Floyd Act, the implementation, the policies that people feel on a day-to-day basis are really very much determined by local and state elections, and there's quite an amount of change and shift and impact that can be made both by engaging in those elections as an elected, as a candidate, but also in ensuring that you vote in those elections.
As a local elected official, I will say hear, hear.
Okay, question, can you also speak to schools to prison as police are brought into schools to respond to behavioral issues of students?
I don't want to take the floor. I'll put on my pediatrician hat. So again, it's about tools, right? So when we have many instances underserved and underfunded schools with kids who have what we often characterize as behavioral health issues, when there's mental health and there's trauma and there's all sorts of things going on, and families that are stressed and fractured, we look to solve those problems through law enforcement presence. And again, those officers are not trained in, many are not trained in, some are, but many are not trained in crisis intervention. And then when you overlay that with the developmental psychology and understanding of children in the school system who may have behavioral and trauma issues, it's a matchup that is very, very difficult to align. So it contributes to the school to prison pipeline if we think that a distressed and traumatized child who's acting out belongs in a police car riding off to a detention center and starting that path in, kindergarten and elementary school. It's not aligned. It doesn't show an understanding of childhood development. It doesn't show an understanding of trauma when we under-resource our schools, and then we try to maintain order through law enforcement. And just as a balance, there are law enforcement officers who do a great job in the schools too, but it's not a natural alignment when we have kids who are struggling and dealing with trauma.
So I have a question. There's a question for Councilman Cunningham. What was your strategy or the strategy at the City Council in Minneapolis in terms of implementing or developing the approach that Minneapolis has taken with respect to public health and safety?
Yes, politics are really hard to navigate. I think that that's a layer of this entire conversation that really we can't forget about. I would say that largely probably one of the reasons why 0 states have comprehensive use of force policies is because the political perspectives of elected officials are so divergent. So that makes that just hits a gridlock, and then it falls down onto the local level to be able to solve all of those problems. We do experience it here on the local level, even when you have a one-party city like Minneapolis. Well, we also have a Green Party member on the city council, but we're almost all Democrats. But we have pretty divergent perspectives on how to be able to move forward in our city post major civil unrest and violence bestowed on our residents at the hands of Minneapolis police officers on a much larger scale during the protests. So with that being said, I have really been leading a lot of the work of actually moving in that direction. So that's why I talk about legislating and institutionalizing this work. So for example, when I got into office, we did not have a Minneapolis Office of Violence Prevention at the city. It was just kind of like a little bit haphazard work where you have group violence intervention taking place in the health department under like youth development, but it worked with adults, And so by having an Office of Violence Prevention that I actually passed an ordinance creating it, it would take a majority of the city council to unmake it. And so the violence prevention approach to public safety. So that's one example, but also another key component is looking at the budget. Police budgets are very large. In Minneapolis, out of our general fund, the police department has about 40% of our general budget goes to Minneapolis Police Department. So what I did is I worked with a couple of my colleagues and reallocated some proposed money, a $10 million increase. We cut that in half because they were going to use it just for overtime and staffing, just kind of like pretty ambiguous. And we use that money. Now we're building out mobile mental health crisis response teams. We're expanding our violence prevention work, and we're investing in our Office of Police Conduct Review so that it's actually at scale to be able to handle the level of complaints that are coming in. So the way that we have to do this is through legislating, where there are opportunities to be able to pass ordinances, pass laws, take those opportunities, really lean into that advocacy. But I would say the most critical component is budgets. Really, like that's where the crux of defund comes from, is because of the fact that police budgets are so huge. And then you look at violence prevention and it's so tiny in comparison. So how are we having more equitable investments across comprehensive approaches to public safety?
Great, thank you. And I think there's time for maybe one more question. It looks like this one is maybe could be addressed to any of you. The question relates to whether cities and police departments across the country that are struggling with reform, are they engaging individuals such as Hannah and Shairi as part of their transformation teams to provide context that goes beyond the current hashtag of the hour? So I guess the question, so Hannah, have you worked at all with any police departments?
Sure, great question. I have the pleasure of working with a doctoral student, Leslie Salas Hernandez, who is working with the Baltimore Police Department right now, is in her dissertation. So Baltimore is under a consent decree. So DOJ is, I see Councilman Cunningham nodding yes. So they're under a consent decree right now. And so she has been working with the DOJ personnel who are kind of on site at BPD on some evaluation of different trainings that they're doing, trying to understand, to what extent are the trainings working? And I think she's had a lot of influence on what they're actually doing. It is difficult because this reform is happening at the same time as the COVID pandemic. So I think that has pretty dramatically changed the ways that officers are interacting with civilians because of the pandemic. And so trying to disentangle whether the DOJ intervention is changing police behavior, or the fact that the police are having much less, many fewer encounters with civilians. I think it's a difficult question to disentangle. But yeah, so they're, on occasion, there are times when police departments are working with people in public health, but I think it's much too rare.
It looks like, okay, one more here. This is for all the panelists, what single intervention at a local level do you think would have an immediate and significant impact on how police interact with both vulnerable populations, and that's homeless, mental health, etc. Multiple questions. Anyone?
Okay. Can I just offer one word? It's a word of caution. My worry is that everybody thinks that one of two things is true, that we will provide behavioral responses in lieu of the police and address the problems with policing, or that this work will be quick and easy. And neither of those two things is true.
Right.
As Councilman Cunningham knows best, I suspect, though maybe we all are aware, I've been learning, municipal government's really complicated and you don't switch things around easily. And I've looked at estimates that vary between about 2 and 10% for the percentage of calls that are behavioral, though there are many more that could benefit from not having police respond. And so my worry is that there's this rush of enthusiasm at this moment, and we'll try to achieve something, and then people will get disappointed and frustrated and give up, and we'll be in the same place that we were 5 or 10 years from now. And so I think we got to realize that this is hard work, and it's work we've got to chart a course to do and then get on that course. I'm not sure when you're ending, Dr. Williams, but I'm going to have to drop off in a second. I just want to apologize in advance for that.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. For the audience, if you could please, they'll launch a poll for you to give us an evaluation. We appreciate that. And I think that'll be up while the next portion of the program begins. Thank you all very, very much for participating. We're looking forward to future collaborations if possible.
Thank you
Thank
very
you
much.
so much, Dr. Williams. So we have just a couple more items on the agenda, so hold on for just a second. As part of our annual Health Equity Symposium, we always honor an individual or individuals with a Vision Award. And the Vision Award is given to those who contribute above and beyond to the Reed Scholars Growth and Development. So this year, I have the pleasure of presenting the 2021 Vision Award to Dr. Cynthia Hodge. She has been very instrumental over the past few years with supporting the Reed Scholars and our growth, instituting new programs. She was the Health Equity Symposium chair for several years. She's on our board of directors. She's very dynamic, and she is not just encouraging, but also just pushes us to be better. And so we are appreciative of that, and we thought that she would be an excellent honoree for this year's Vision Award. So we'd like to give Dr. Hodge a few minutes to address the audience if she like. Did you get something in the mail from us, Dr. Hodge?
I did. And this is the beautiful Vision Award. Hopefully you all can see it. And I just want to thank Mary and Denise, the Symposium Committee, and everybody who elected not to follow my instructions, because I was not the person that I recommended this award be given to. But I do want to thank you and just say it just gives me a lot of joy to work with Reed Scholars. I see so much potential in our group, and I'm really just looking forward to the day when Reed Scholars will achieve prominence nationally and globally and be the go-to organization for anything health related to health equity. So that's why I do what I do, and I hope more Reed Scholars will get involved and participate in the many activities that we have going on, and encourage others to participate in the organization. It's really a dynamic group and probably the best group that I've been a part of. Thank you for honoring me. It's always an honor to receive an award by your peers, and this is definitely an honor for me. So thank you.
Thank you. And you definitely deserve it. Thank you for everything that you've done for me and for us.
Thank you.
So with that, we'll spend the last couple seconds closing. I would like to again thank all of our panelists for participating in this year's symposium. I think it was a fabulous conversation with lots of insights from various perspectives that gives us a little bit more information on how to address policing reform and the much needed work that we've done, but the much needed work that we still have to do. Thank you for those who attended virtually. We really appreciate the support. And of course, our Health Equity Symposium Committee, who was chaired this year by Dr. Williams. You did a great job. Thank you so much. And of course, we can't do anything without the help of the DICP office. So thank you so much to Jackie and Thomas and Ying for making this possible. And lastly, we of course always forever indebted to Dr. Reed, who continues to believe in us and encourages us to strive for health equity in all that we do. So I hope that you all will follow us on our social media platforms, on Facebook, on Twitter, Instagram, and of course our YouTube channel, where we host a weekly podcast called Reed Scholars Live. And of course, if you forget any of these things, you can always just go to our website and you can figure out how to contact us, how to follow us, and any updates on activities and events and accomplishments of the Reed Scholars as a whole. So with that, thank you, everyone. Hope you have a good rest of your day, and we will see you soon.